The chandeliers of Hawthorne assembly rooms burned like constellations above the crowded ballroom, scattering golden light across silk gowns and polished marble floors. Music from the orchestra drifted through the hall in graceful waves, guiding couples through elegant turns while laughter fluttered through the air like bright birds. Yet amid all that brilliance, Miss Eleanor Whitmore sat alone beside a marble column, her gloved hands folded quietly in her lap. It was the fourth dance of the evening, and not once had a gentleman approached her. She watched as other young ladies accepted gloved hands and stepped eagerly into the waltz, their faces glowing with the soft triumph that came from being chosen. Eleanor offered each passing couple the same polite smile she had practiced for years. It was the expression expected of a lady who must endure disappointment without allowing it to show. Still, whispers traveled swiftly through fashionable rooms. "She has been attending the season for 3 years now," murmured one woman behind a lace fan. "And still no offer," another replied with delicate cruelty. Eleanor pretended not to hear. She had grown accustomed to the soft blade of gossip. London society was rarely loud in its judgments, yet it possessed an unmatched talent for making a person feel quietly invisible. At 22, Eleanor had crossed the fragile boundary between hopeful debutante and unfortunate curiosity. Her father's modest estate had dwindled under years of poor harvests, and her dowry was little more than a polite formality. She was not considered plain exactly. Her dark hair carried a gentle sheen beneath candlelight, and her gray eyes held a thoughtful depth. But beauty in London ballrooms was measured against dazzling standards, and Eleanor possessed the softer kind that rarely stopped a room. Across the floor, Lady Pennington laughed brightly as 3 gentlemen competed for the honor of her next dance. Eleanor lowered her gaze and traced the delicate embroidery along her gown sleeve. Her mother had insisted upon the pale blue silk. "It must suggest freshness," Mrs. Whitmore had declared anxiously earlier that evening. "Men prefer the illusion of newness." Eleanor had nodded obediently. Yet as the hours passed, she felt less like a blooming flower and more like something gently fading at the edge of the room. A sudden ripple of laughter rose near the refreshment table. 2 young ladies leaned together in conspiratorial amusement. "She will surely become a governess," one whispered. "No," the other replied. "I believe she will simply remain Miss Whitmore forever." Eleanor's breath caught, though she did not move. Pride required stillness in moments such as these. She lifted her chin slightly and directed her attention toward the dancers once more. The orchestra shifted into a new melody. A tall gentleman approached the row of seated ladies, bowing politely to each before selecting a partner. Eleanor felt a brief, foolish flutter of hope when his gaze passed over her. But he moved on. The dance floor swallowed him and his chosen companion while Eleanor remained precisely where she had begun. From across the room, Mrs. Whitmore observed the scene with tightening concern. A mother could recognize the slow erosion of hope in her daughter's posture. When the dance ended, she crossed the ballroom and sat beside Eleanor. "My dear," she said gently, though worry lined her voice, "you must not appear so distant. Gentlemen prefer a lively spirit." "I am trying, Mamma," Eleanor replied quietly. Mrs. Whitmore hesitated before producing a folded letter from her reticule. "This arrived earlier today." The paper bore a heavy wax seal stamped with a crest Eleanor did not recognize. Her mother's hands trembled faintly as she passed it over. "It is from a noble household," she continued. Eleanor broke the seal with careful fingers. The handwriting inside was precise, almost severe. The letter stated that His Grace the Duke of Blackthorne sought a wife of respectable character and modest temperament. The arrangement would be swift and discreet. Financial security for the bride's family would be guaranteed. Eleanor read the words twice before looking up. "A duke?" she asked softly. "Yes. But why me?" Mrs. Whitmore's gaze drifted toward the ballroom as if unwilling to meet her daughter's eyes. "The Duke of Blackthorne is a widower." Eleanor waited. "And he suffered a terrible carriage accident some years ago," her mother added carefully. "He has not walked since." The orchestra's music seemed suddenly distant. Understanding arrived slowly, like cold water spreading through silk. No ambitious family wished to offer their daughter to a crippled duke. But a struggling household might accept the bargain with gratitude. "I see," Eleanor murmured. Her mother clasped her hand urgently. "It is a respectable offer, my love. You would be a duchess." Eleanor looked across the ballroom once more. Couples spun beneath the chandeliers, their laughter rising above the music. Every young woman here dreamed of a title, yet none had been chosen for this one. Because this title came with shadows. "When must we answer?" Eleanor asked. "The Duke's steward expects our reply tomorrow." Eleanor folded the letter carefully. Somewhere within the hall a gentleman promised eternal devotion to a laughing girl while the orchestra swelled triumphantly. The contrast felt almost absurd. She rose slowly from her chair. "I believe," she said with quiet steadiness, "that we should return home." Mrs. Whitmore searched her face anxiously but nodded. Outside, night mist curled through the lantern-lit streets as their carriage carried them away from the brilliant ballroom. Eleanor watched the glowing windows fade behind them, feeling as though she were leaving an entire world she had never quite entered. A duke who could not walk. A marriage no one else desired. Yet as the carriage wheels echoed across the silent road, Eleanor unfolded the letter once more. Near the bottom of the page, beneath the formal request, a single line had been written in a different hand. A hand that carried unmistakable strength. "If Miss Whitmore accepts, she shall have my word that she will never be treated as a burden in my house." Eleanor stared at the sentence while the carriage rolled deeper into the fog, wondering what kind of man felt compelled to write such a promise before ever meeting his bride. Morning arrived beneath a sky the color of pale pewter, and by noon the quiet church of St. Bartholomew stood prepared for a wedding that London society regarded with curious fascination. Eleanor Whitmore stepped from the carriage with steady composure, though her heart moved like something fragile within her ribs. A thin veil softened the world around her, turning the gathered guests into a blur of dark coats and muted whispers. No orchestra waited here, no glittering ballroom, no bright celebration. The ceremony had been arranged with deliberate modesty, as though the occasion itself preferred not to attract too much attention. Inside the church, candlelight flickered gently along rows of worn wooden pews. Eleanor walked beside her mother toward the altar, the quiet echo of her footsteps sounding far louder than she wished. She could feel the curiosity of every gaze following her progress. The Duke of Blackthorne waited at the front of the chapel. He sat in a finely crafted wheelchair of polished walnut, its wheels gleaming faintly beneath the candlelight. Eleanor had imagined a fragile man bent beneath misfortune. Instead she saw a figure whose presence seemed to command the entire room. Alexander Blackthorne possessed broad shoulders and a straight posture that suggested strength untouched by weakness. His dark hair was brushed neatly away from a thoughtful brow, and his gray eyes held a depth that felt almost unsettling in their calmness. The lower half of his body remained motionless beneath a tailored coat, yet nothing in his expression asked for sympathy. When Eleanor reached the altar, his gaze lifted to meet hers. For a moment neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt strangely intimate, like the pause before a storm breaks across still water. The vicar cleared his throat softly and began the ceremony. The words flowed in solemn rhythm, familiar vows echoing through the small chapel. Eleanor listened carefully, though each promise carried an unfamiliar weight. Marriage had once existed for her as a distant dream filled with affection and laughter. Now it arrived as something far quieter, shaped by necessity rather than romance. When the moment came for their vows, the Duke spoke first. His voice carried a low, measured confidence that filled the room without effort. "I, Alexander Blackthorne, take thee, Eleanor Whitmore, to be my lawful wife." There was no tremor in his tone, no sign of reluctance. Yet Eleanor sensed something guarded beneath the composure, as though the man beside her had long ago placed certain parts of himself beyond reach. When her turn arrived, she answered with equal steadiness. "I, Eleanor Whitmore, take thee, Alexander Blackthorne, to be my lawful husband." The vicar pronounced them married soon after, and the quiet gathering released a polite murmur of approval. Eleanor felt the weight of a new title settle upon her shoulders with almost physical clarity. Duchess of Blackthorne. The word seemed to belong to someone else. Outside, the autumn wind stirred the branches of ancient oaks while their carriage waited along the gravel path. Guests offered brief congratulations before departing quickly, eager perhaps to carry the story back into London drawing rooms. Within minutes the churchyard fell nearly silent. The Duke's steward assisted him smoothly into the carriage while Eleanor stepped inside after him. The door closed with a firm, final sound that seemed to mark the true beginning of their marriage. For several moments the carriage moved without conversation. The countryside rolled past in quiet shades of green and gray, fields fading beneath low clouds. Eleanor folded her hands together, uncertain whether she ought to speak first. At last the Duke broke the silence. "Miss Whitmore," he said thoughtfully, then paused. "Forgive me. That name no longer belongs to you." She turned toward him slightly. "I imagine it will take some time to grow accustomed to the new one." A faint expression touched his mouth, almost a smile but not quite. "I suspect many adjustments await us both." The carriage rocked gently over a narrow bridge while distant crows circled above the fields. Eleanor gathered her courage. Your Grace, I hope you do not feel obliged to offer explanations for this arrangement. I understand that circumstances. He lifted a hand softly, stopping her. I would rather speak plainly. His gray eyes held hers with surprising directness. Neither of us chose this marriage out of affection. That much is obvious. Yet I wish you to know something from the beginning. The carriage slowed as the road curved toward a wooded hill. You will never be expected to serve as my nurse or caretaker, he continued quietly. My household is well prepared for my condition. Eleanor felt an unexpected warmth in the words. And more importantly, he added, you will have complete freedom within my house. She studied him carefully. You speak as though you expect me to resent you. The Duke looked toward the window, watching the passing trees. I have learned not to expect generosity from strangers. The honesty in his voice carried no bitterness, only quiet certainty. Eleanor considered this. You are not a stranger, she said gently. You are my husband. The word surprised them both. A long moment passed before Alexander answered. That remains to be seen. The carriage climbed higher along the winding road, and soon the first towers of Blackthorne Hall appeared above the treeline. The estate rose from the mist like something carved from shadow and stone, vast and solemn against the gray sky. Eleanor felt a small tightening in her chest. This place would be her home now. Servants waited along the front steps as the carriage rolled to a stop. The Duke's steward helped him descend first before assisting Eleanor beside him. For the first time she saw the estate clearly. Tall windows reflected the dim light of afternoon while ivy climbed the ancient walls like dark lace. The building carried an atmosphere of quiet dignity, yet something about it felt profoundly lonely. Alexander noticed her gaze. My wife, he said calmly, welcome to Blackthorne. The doors opened slowly. As Eleanor stepped inside, she sensed that the great house was watching her just as carefully as the man who had brought her here. And somewhere deep within those silent corridors, she wondered whether she had entered a life defined by duty alone, or one that would reveal secrets she had not yet begun to imagine. The first days at Blackthorne Hall unfolded with a quietness that seemed almost deliberate, as though the house itself were watching its new duchess with cautious curiosity. Eleanor moved through wide corridors where every footstep echoed softly against stone floors polished by generations of careful servants. Tall windows admitted pale autumn light that drifted across tapestries and dark wooden paneling, revealing a home rich in history yet touched by an unmistakable stillness. The household greeted her with formal courtesy. Servants bowed respectfully, yet their eyes carried the subtle curiosity reserved for someone who had arrived under unusual circumstances. A young maid guided Eleanor through the rooms prepared for her, a spacious chamber overlooking the gardens, a dressing room filled with polished mirrors, and a private sitting room warmed by a small fire. Everything had been arranged with thoughtful precision. Yet the Duke himself remained distant. Alexander Blackthorne appeared only during meals, where conversation remained polite and restrained. His presence at the long dining table carried quiet authority, though he spoke sparingly as if accustomed to silence. Eleanor found herself studying him when he looked away, trying to understand the man who had become her husband through necessity rather than affection. His movements were practiced and controlled, each turn of his wheelchair handled with calm dignity. There was no bitterness in his manner, yet neither did he offer the easy warmth she had once imagined might exist within marriage. On the third morning, Eleanor woke to find something unexpected waiting in the small drawing room beside her chamber. A slender book lay upon the polished table, its leather cover deep green and delicately worn. She recognized the title immediately. It was a collection of poetry by Thomas Gray, one she had mentioned in passing during the carriage ride after their wedding. She touched the book with quiet surprise. No note accompanied the gift. When she entered the breakfast room later, Alexander sat near the window reviewing estate papers. The morning light softened the sharp lines of his expression, though his attention remained firmly fixed on the documents before him. Good morning, Your Grace, Eleanor said gently. He inclined his head. Good morning. She waited a moment, expecting him to mention the book. He did not. Breakfast passed in calm silence, broken only by the occasional clink of silver against porcelain. Eleanor wondered whether she should thank him, yet something in his composed manner suggested that such acknowledgment might embarrass him. Afterward she returned to the drawing room and opened the book. Inside the front cover she discovered a small mark in the corner of one page, as though someone had paused there before. The poem beneath the mark spoke of quiet dignity and overlooked beauty, words that seemed chosen with unusual care. Eleanor closed the book slowly. Later that afternoon she walked through the gardens, guided by gravel paths that wound between hedges trimmed with precise attention. The air carried the cool scent of fallen leaves. As she turned a corner near the rose arbor, she noticed a gardener placing fresh flowers within a small vase on a stone bench. The blossoms were winter roses, pale and delicate. "For her Grace," the gardener explained respectfully. Eleanor paused. "For me?" "Yes, Your Grace." His Grace instructed that the gardens provide whatever you might enjoy. She thanked the man quietly and carried the roses with her as she continued along the path. Something within her began to shift. The Duke remained distant in conversation, yet these gestures suggested an attentiveness that contradicted his reserved manner. That evening, as twilight settled across the estate, Eleanor entered the library for the first time. The room stretched wide and tall, lined with shelves that climbed toward a painted ceiling. A fire burned gently in the hearth, casting warm light across rows of leather-bound volumes. Alexander sat near the fire, reading. He looked up when she entered. For a moment neither spoke. "This room is remarkable," Eleanor said softly. "It has been my refuge for many years," he replied. She placed the book of poetry on a nearby table. "I believe someone left this for me." His gaze flickered briefly toward the volume. "I hoped you might find it agreeable." The admission was simple, yet something about it felt unexpectedly intimate. "Thank you," she said. He inclined his head again, though a faint uncertainty touched his expression. Silence returned, but it no longer felt uncomfortable. Eleanor studied the firelight dancing across the shelves. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why did you choose me?" The question lingered in the quiet room. Alexander did not answer immediately. Instead he closed his book and rested his hands lightly upon its cover. "When my steward described your situation," he said slowly, "he spoke of your composure, of your refusal to complain despite circumstances that might have embittered others." Eleanor listened carefully. "I required someone who understood dignity," he continued, "not ambition. And you believed I possessed such qualities?" "I believed," he said quietly, "that you might understand solitude." The honesty in his voice carried an unexpected weight. Eleanor looked into the fire, considering his words. "You speak as though loneliness is something to be shared." "Perhaps it is," he answered. The flames shifted softly in the hearth. Then a servant entered the library with a sealed letter upon a silver tray. "For His Grace." Alexander accepted it with a faint nod and broke the seal. As he read, the calm expression on his face changed almost imperceptibly. Eleanor noticed the shift immediately. "Is something wrong?" He folded the letter slowly. "It appears," he said with measured restraint, "that a distant cousin of mine has decided to involve himself in the affairs of this household." She sensed tension beneath the composed tone. "In what way?" Alexander looked toward the darkening window. "He believes that a man who cannot walk should not be permitted to govern an estate of this size." The words settled heavily between them. "And what will you do?" Eleanor asked quietly. For a moment Alexander said nothing. Then he turned back to her, his gray eyes reflecting the firelight with unexpected intensity. "I intend," he said calmly, "to prove him wrong." But as Eleanor watched his steady expression, she realized something far more troubling. The challenge had already begun. News of the Duke's cousin traveled through Blackthorne Hall with the quiet speed of a gathering storm. Though the servants spoke little of it in Eleanor's presence, she felt the tension settle over the estate like a subtle chill. Doors closed more carefully, voices lowered in the corridors, and the steward appeared twice as vigilant as before. Alexander, however, behaved as though nothing unusual had occurred. He continued his daily routine with calm precision, reviewing estate accounts in the morning and receiving tenants in the study during the afternoon. Yet Eleanor began to notice the small signs that betrayed the strain beneath his composure. The faint tightening of his jaw when a letter arrived from London, the longer hours spent alone in the library after sunset. 3 days after the letter's arrival, the cousin himself appeared. The carriage rolled up the gravel drive shortly before dusk, its black lacquered sides reflecting the fading light. Eleanor watched from the tall drawing-room windows as a tall gentleman stepped down with confident ease. He moved with the assured grace of someone accustomed to admiration. His coat was cut to the newest London fashion, and his dark hair was arranged with meticulous care. The steward entered moments later. "Your Grace," he said respectfully to Alexander, who sat near the fire with Eleanor beside him, "Mr. Julian Blackthorne has arrived." Alexander's expression did not change. "Show him in." The door opened soon after. Julian Blackthorne entered the room with an easy smile that never quite reached his eyes. His gaze swept across the chamber before settling briefly upon Eleanor. "So this is the new Duchess of Blackthorne," he said smoothly. "London has been most curious to meet you." Eleanor rose politely. "Mr. Blackthorne." His bow was courteous, though the gesture carried an unmistakable edge of amusement. Alexander remained seated, his posture perfectly composed. "You have traveled far to visit an estate you have shown little interest in for many years," he said calmly. Julian clasped his hands behind his back and began strolling slowly across the carpet, examining the paintings that lined the walls. "Family duty can awaken suddenly," he replied lightly, "particularly when the head of that family has experienced certain misfortunes." The implication hung openly in the air. Eleanor felt the insult immediately. Alexander's voice remained level. "You did not come merely to observe my circumstances." "No," Julian admitted. "I came because London society has begun to ask a rather uncomfortable question." He turned to face them fully. "Is the Duke of Blackthorne truly capable of governing his lands?" Silence fell across the room. Eleanor felt anger rise quietly within her, yet she remained still, sensing that Alexander wished to answer in his own way. Julian continued before he could speak. "A widowed duke who rarely leaves his estate. A sudden marriage to a woman of modest fortune. And a household run almost entirely by stewards and clerks." He tilted his head slightly. "It invites speculation." Alexander regarded him steadily. "You mistake patience for weakness." Julian smiled. "Perhaps. Yet others may not be so charitable." Eleanor stepped forward before she could reconsider. "My husband's abilities are not a matter for speculation," she said clearly. Julian's eyes flickered toward her with faint surprise. "And yet speculation is precisely what fills the drawing rooms of London, Your Grace." Alexander lifted a hand gently. "Eleanor." But she did not retreat. "You traveled here to provoke doubt," she continued calmly. "Yet the tenants of this estate appear well cared for, and the household runs with admirable order. I see no evidence that the Duke's condition has diminished his judgment." Julian studied her thoughtfully. "An admirable defense." "I am not defending him," she replied. "I am stating the obvious." For a moment, something sharper entered Julian's expression. "I suspect London will soon demand a more public demonstration." Alexander's gaze narrowed slightly. "What sort of demonstration?" "A gathering," Julian said lightly. "A charity ball perhaps. Invite the neighboring aristocracy. Allow them to see the Duke presiding over his house once more." The suggestion sounded harmless, yet Eleanor sensed the trap immediately. A ballroom filled with London's most critical observers would offer Julian the perfect opportunity to expose any weakness. Alexander understood as well. "You hope society will see a broken man attempting to imitate his former power." Julian spread his hands. "Or they will see a capable duke whose reputation deserves restoration. Surely you have nothing to fear." The room remained silent for several seconds. Then Alexander spoke. "Very well." Eleanor turned toward him in surprise. "We will host the ball." Julian's smile widened with quiet triumph. "I look forward to it." He bowed once more before leaving the room with smooth confidence. The door closed softly behind him. Eleanor faced her husband. That was exactly what he wanted. "Yes." "Then why agree?" Alexander wheeled slowly toward the window, where twilight had settled across the gardens. "Because if I refuse, his whispers will grow louder." She stepped closer. "And if you accept, he will watch for every sign of weakness." Alexander's reflection stared back at them from the glass. "For 10 years, he said quietly, society has assumed my life ended the night that carriage overturned." Eleanor heard the faint steel beneath his calm tone. "Perhaps it is time they learned otherwise." She studied him carefully. "You intend to face them all?" "Yes." "And Julian?" Alexander turned back toward her. The firelight caught the determined intensity in his gray eyes. "I intend to remind him that this house still belongs to me." A long silence followed, filled only by the quiet crackle of the hearth. Eleanor felt the weight of the challenge before them. A single evening could restore the Duke's reputation, or destroy it completely. At last she spoke. "Then we will prepare the most magnificent ball Blackthorne Hall has ever seen." Alexander looked at her with sudden curiosity. "We?" She met his gaze steadily. "You may have married me out of practicality, Your Grace," she said softly. "But I refuse to watch your enemies circle without answering them." For the first time since their marriage, something warmer than restraint touched his expression. "Very well, Duchess." Days passed in a whirl of preparation. Servants polished chandeliers that had not been lit in years. Musicians were summoned from London. Invitations traveled across the countryside, each sealed with the Blackthorne crest. And with every passing hour, Eleanor could feel anticipation spreading beyond the estate. Society was eager to witness the spectacle. On the night of the ball, carriages began arriving long before sunset. Lanterns illuminated the great entrance while elegant guests stepped out beneath the rising moon. Laughter drifted through the halls as music swelled once more within the grand ballroom. Eleanor stood beside Alexander at the top of the staircase as the doors opened. Hundreds of eyes turned toward them. Among the crowd below, Julian Blackthorne watched with quiet expectation. He believed the evening would reveal weakness. But as Eleanor placed her hand lightly upon the Duke's shoulder and the music rose through the glittering hall, she sensed something entirely different unfolding. And somewhere deep within that watching crowd, the first whisper began to change. Music unfurled through the grand ballroom of Blackthorne Hall like a ribbon of light, filling the vaulted chamber with elegant vitality. Chandeliers that had remained dark for years now blazed above polished floors, their crystal prisms scattering gold across gowns of velvet and silk. The room glittered with the presence of neighboring aristocrats, visiting dignitaries, and curious observers who had traveled many miles for a single purpose: to see whether the Duke of Blackthorne still possessed the authority his title demanded. Eleanor stood beside Alexander at the top of the sweeping staircase, her gloved hand resting lightly upon the carved banister. She felt the weight of the moment pressing gently upon her shoulders, yet she held herself with steady grace. The murmuring crowd below lifted their faces toward them with unmistakable anticipation. Alexander's posture remained perfectly composed within his chair. Yet Eleanor sensed the tension beneath that composure. It lived in the quiet firmness of his jaw and in the deliberate calm of his breathing. At the far side of the ballroom, Julian Blackthorne watched with polite interest, his expression carefully neutral as guests applauded the Duke's appearance. The applause was respectful but uncertain. Alexander inclined his head in acknowledgement, then guided his chair slowly forward toward the staircase ramp that had been constructed for the evening. The movement was smooth and dignified, revealing none of the hesitation Julian had clearly hoped to witness. Eleanor descended beside him, each step measured, her gaze lifted confidently toward the crowd. The orchestra swelled as they reached the ballroom floor. "Ladies and gentlemen," the steward announced clearly, "Their Grace, the Duke and Duchess of Blackthorne." The room answered with renewed applause. Alexander moved through the gathering with quiet authority, greeting guests with composed warmth. Eleanor followed close beside him, offering smiles and brief conversation that gradually softened the atmosphere. What had begun as a spectacle slowly transformed into something resembling genuine celebration. Dancers soon filled the floor, their graceful turns reflecting candlelight and shifting patterns. Laughter rose beneath the music and the great hall, silent for so many years, seemed to awaken. Yet Julian remained patient. Near midnight, as the orchestra paused between dances, he stepped forward from the crowd. "Your Grace," he said, his voice carrying clearly enough to capture attention. Conversations faltered. Alexander turned toward him. "Mr. Blackthorne." Julian offered a courteous bow. "This evening has been most impressive. You have clearly restored much life to this house." His tone suggested praise, yet Eleanor sensed the sharpened edge beneath the words. "However," Julian continued, "there remains a matter that concerns many among our guests." The ballroom quieted further. Julian gestured lightly toward the gathered aristocrats. "Some have wondered whether the Duke of Blackthorne truly governs this estate himself, or whether others act in his name." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Alexander regarded him steadily. "You question my authority in my own house." "I question only appearances," Julian replied smoothly. "A man confined by such unfortunate limitations must rely heavily upon assistance." Eleanor felt anger flicker through her chest, yet she remained silent. Alexander's gaze did not waver. "For 10 years," he said calmly, "I have managed these lands with the help of capable stewards and loyal tenants. The prosperity of this estate speaks for itself." Julian smiled faintly. "Prosperity can be inherited. Leadership must be demonstrated." The challenge was unmistakable. The guests waited in tense silence. Alexander studied Julian for a long moment before responding. "Very well." He turned slightly toward Eleanor. "My Duchess," he said quietly, "would you assist me?" She met his eyes, sensing something profound within his calm request. Without hesitation, she stepped beside him. Alexander reached for a slender cane that rested against the side of his chair. The motion alone drew sudden attention from the crowd. Julian's smile faded. Slowly, carefully, Alexander placed the cane against the floor. Eleanor felt her breath catch as he shifted his weight forward. For a moment nothing happened. Then, with visible effort, the Duke rose. Gasps spread through the ballroom. The movement was not smooth. His legs trembled beneath the strain, and the cane bore much of his weight. Yet he stood upright, his shoulders squared with determined dignity. Eleanor steadied him with a gentle hand at his arm. The room remained utterly silent. Alexander looked directly at Julian. "You wish to see leadership demonstrated?" he said quietly. His voice carried no anger, only steady resolve. Julian stared in disbelief. "You cannot possibly." Alexander took one careful step forward. The effort was immense, yet he did not falter. Then another step followed. Eleanor walked beside him, her presence offering silent strength rather than support. The crowd watched as the Duke crossed the small distance across the ballroom floor. When he finally paused, he stood tall despite the visible strain in his body. "That," he said calmly, "is what determination looks like." For a moment no one spoke. Then applause erupted across the room, rising first from scattered guests and quickly swelling into a thunderous ovation. Julian's expression hardened. "You think theatrics will silence doubt?" he demanded. Alexander met his gaze. "I think courage will." The applause grew louder. Eleanor felt emotion surge through her chest as she looked at her husband. Only weeks earlier she had believed him a distant, reserved stranger. Now she saw the quiet strength that had carried him through years of solitude and pain. Alexander turned slightly toward her. "You once asked why I chose you," he said softly. She nodded. "Because you understand dignity," he continued. "And because you refuse to see weakness where others saw only limitation." His gray eyes softened. "I had forgotten how powerful that belief could be." Eleanor felt warmth rise to her cheeks. "I only reminded you of what already existed." Julian watched them both with cold frustration. "Enjoy your victory while it lasts," he muttered before turning sharply and leaving the ballroom. The doors closed behind him, carrying away the last trace of challenge. Music resumed slowly, and conversation returned with renewed excitement. Guests now spoke with admiration rather than curiosity, their whispers transforming into praise. Blackthorne Hall no longer seemed a house overshadowed by tragedy. It had become the setting of something far more compelling. Later, when the final guests had departed and the chandeliers dimmed, Eleanor walked beside Alexander through the quiet garden terrace. The night air carried the cool scent of roses. He sat once more in his chair, the cane resting across his lap, though the memory of his standing presence lingered vividly in her mind. "You did not need to prove anything tonight," she said gently. "Perhaps not," he replied. "But I wish to." He studied the moonlit garden for a moment before speaking again. "I feared this marriage might imprison you within a life of obligation." Eleanor smiled softly. "Instead it appears to have given me something rather extraordinary." Alexander looked toward her. "And what is that?" She met his gaze with quiet certainty. "A man who refuses to surrender to the world's expectations." The wind stirred the rose branches above them. Alexander reached for her hand. "I was forced into this marriage," he said quietly. "But loving you was never something I expected." Eleanor's fingers tightened gently around his. "Nor I." For a long moment they remained there beneath the moonlight, the silence between them no longer lonely but filled with shared understanding. And somewhere beyond the garden walls, the story of the lonely widowed Duke and the woman who had chosen to stand beside him was already beginning to travel through London. Not as a tale of pity, but as something far rarer. A love born not from circumstance alone, but from courage, dignity, and the quiet decision to believe in one another when the world had expected neither of them to try.